So, about 16 years ago, the U.S. learned a hard lesson that a renegade group of remnants of Russian resistance in Afghanistan could affect loss of life, within domestic U.S. In the last 16 years, the world has become increasingly digitalized, increasingly interconnected. We're even closer now. We're talking about nation-state-sponsored cyber attacks. And even more recent proof coming from Ukraine, an attack by Russia on Ukraine infrastructure called Petya spread around the world within 2 to 3 days and shut down hospitals and shipping infrastructure, et cetera. So we decided to put together a panel of some global experts to talk about why Ukraine is strategically important, both to the West commercially as well as politically, and decided to talk about this front lines of Russia's Infowar machine. And then we brought Bob Flores, partner of Cognitio, past enterprise CTO of the CIA, Phillip Lohaus, research fellow, Marilyn Ware scholar at American Enterprise Institute, and Dmytro Shymkiv, secretary of the National Reforms Council of Ukraine. So our goal is to talk about really 3 things. One, why Ukraine is strategically vital on multiple levels to business, politics, what is happening in Ukraine today, and pay close attention when Dmytro's talking about it, because these tactics have a way of evolving from the testing ground, proving ground, into Western Europe and the United States. And then kind of in closing, where do we go from here? How do we think about this? So let's just start with, the first question. Why is Ukraine strategically important to us in terms of our knowledge of what's going on there and how cybersecurity evolves, et cetera? Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a great honor. When you look at the last 3 years, Ukraine being on the front lines, and Russia being experimenting with a lot of different tools and technology, that later the West being exposed. When we look at the history of all this, it started with the one similar idea that was just discussed in the previous panel, to disrupt, destroy the West presence, the influence or the decisions that Ukrainian citizens want to express. But also to experiment what kind of tools could be used to influence decision-making and the behaviors and destruction in the West. So there was a hearings in the Congress on the Russian influence. And General Charles Cleveland made a very interesting point. Recently, there was mentioning the 5 space. He mentioned 6 space. We've been very good in the conventional warfare in the 4 areas, the classical: sea, land, air, and space. There is 2 new ones where the world been failing significantly. The first is a cyber, and we're going to talk about this. But the second is humans. We are all easily influenced. We can say we are not, we know how to filter, we know how to look at this. Through 3 years of working and facing this, anybody, including myself, are vulnerable to the social influence on me, on my family, on my kids, on anybody of your friends. And in 3 months, a nice bot was going to knock on your account, and you're going to accept them. In 3 months, in additional 3 months, that bot is going to like what you post. In additional 3 months, you're going to like what he or she, or whatever, it posts. And then you become part of the game. So when we're looking into what's being done, I want to look at a few cases. So cases is actually quite easier because it gives you a parallel looking. So first is the critical infrastructure. We faced the disruption on the energy grid in 2015 and later 2016. The virus that's been identified in Ukraine, and think about this, 6 months, the hackers been stealthing, trying to study how it all works. And then you should, we read a lot of science fiction. That wasn't a science fiction. The people who've been operating computer infrastructure physically saw how the mice is switching off switches that supply electricity to the grid. The same virus was found in US and Israel later. And Thanks God, things being addressed. Nevertheless, last year, the situation in Kansas proved that this is still possible. Another one is the Ministry of Finance. Another 6 months, the whole infrastructure in the Ministry of Finance and Treasury have been wiped out. Took another things to recover. The story of the PETA virus, or correct version is PETA.A, was not initially, we all thought it's a virus and it's big destruction. First, this virus never had, or a ransomware, it's never had anything for recovery. And one account to which you could pay money, which actually been non-functional. But when we did analysis with the cyber police and unfolded what's happened before, the Russians, and we clearly attribute it to Russians, used the software which every company in Ukraine been using for submitting their tax reports. For 3 months, they've been updating 400,000 companies. And this is not just ordinary computers. It's the computers of CFOs and chief accountants. And within the code that's been distributed to these computers, they've been extracting financial informations, they've been extracting digital signatures, and hell knows what. We don't know. Because it's all been, whatever being extracted to third-party servers. And then, in the classical Soviet style, when the Soviets robbed the villages in Ukraine during hunger times, they burned the buildings, the villages. So they decided to create a virus that burned this PC, or the computer but it was constructed in the way so it spread to the whole organization within an hour. And if you didn't switch off your computer within an hour, your computer becomes a brick. Within first hours, the top major companies in Ukraine lost almost 90% of their infrastructure. Computers become really physically bricks. Information gets lost. It gets spread to the other countries through VPN connections. And basically it's become burning the whole villages in the paradigm. So this is a cyber warfare. Every day my team, and I'm responsible for cybersecurity of the presidential office, we see viruses which are not any more detectable, or definitely we're not using Kaspersky for the last 3 years. Thanks. We've actually been talking to my colleagues in the US about the threat. Unfortunately, people thought it's a joke. No, it's not. We've seen viruses which are targeting particular individuals in particular departments, and they're constructed based on the social understanding of the social behavior of particular people in particular social media. There is a diverse amount of the social media and their families. So now, jumping from the cyber, I want to talk about a few things about fake news and social media. We banned access to the 2 major social networks which Russia developed. It's VK of Kontakte and Odnoklassniki, or classmates type of. Since 2013, there was an evidence that these social networks been collecting information, and in Ukraine, basically, it's around 46% of population. So you have information about likes, don't like, social behavior, Cambridge Analytics story, but in mass scale, fully accessible to FSB. People say, well, it's a science fiction. It's not. When annexation of Crimea took place, they shut down internet to Ukraine, and they used social media to influence people's behavior. And you can influence people's behavior. You're not going to tell them, go and vote, but you do it in a nice way, posting things through the friends, etc. And you can automate this. There is a whole factory next to St. Pete who's doing this. So, on top of it, the recruitment to the militaries in the eastern Ukraine was also done through the social media, targeting the right people who have incline. Russia recruits psychiatrists, scientists, neurologists who construct these things to target particular individuals. So this happened in Ukraine, was trying to penetrate election 2013, and they actually penetrate the server that showed the results, with the whole idea to disrupt. But then when we start seeing this in US, 190 million user accounts of US citizens been found on some of the servers recently. Then if you look at what happened in Qatar, when they disrupt the conflict between 2 states, between Saudis and Qatar, If you look what they've done in Montenegro recently, when they tried to join and they start joining the NATO, look at what they did in France, Germany, Netherlands. All this was using cyberspace and social space of humans to influence decision making. And the social media and the fake news story is something that we experienced from the very beginning. We created even a project. Initially, the Western partners look at us with a joke. Okay, fake news, how are you going to prove it, freedom of speech, etc. Russia adds to the story of fake 40% truth. So it looks true, but it's a fake. And we built a team of Ukrainian journalists who have been focusing on digital transformation of their society. Develop a team who over 3 years built a methodology and approach of 30 different journalists. And now it's multi-language. They identify more than 1,000 different stories that's been spread with one single intention: disrupt, divert, deny, and destroy. That's the whole vision that Russia. I haven't talked about very interesting experiment, and I will stop.
I wanted to ask them if either one of you think this will stay in Ukraine, or I know some of it's already spread, but what's your perspective on how this will impact the stuff going on that he's talking about? It's going to impact us over the coming years.
Well, Ukraine's a big experiment, and it's not the only one. I mean, you can go back to Estonia, the stuff that happened in Georgia, the stuff that happened during the Olympics. And so I think people need to treat this stuff very, very seriously, because this is just a jumping off point to the rest of the world. You know, the previous panel talked about China wanting to be, worldwide domination. Yeah, Mr. Putin will have something to say about that. It's been no secret that they're trying to reconsolidate in Russia. And that's just the beginning, folks, as we've already seen with the annexation of Crimea. So I would be afraid.
Yeah, just to jump in here, I mean, I think one of the things, and I'm not a technical expert like most of the people in this room, but when I look at Russia, and even from the previous panel with respect to what we were talking about with China and about these new domains of warfare, so to speak, I actually think, and with all due respect to General Cleveland, who I know and he's a great guy and everything, I think that actually, his way of categorizing it in these different dimensions, I think actually gets to the core of the problem. Because Russia and China alike, China has a term for it, informatization of warfare. Mm-hmm. They view the information spectrum as being something they want to dominate, and information as applied to air, as applied to sea, as applied to space. Like, in other words, these are not separate domains. And I think if you look at Russia's behavior, you see this as well, even going back historically. And we can get into why that's the reason. A lot of that has to do with, we in the West, in our Enlightenment tradition, we tend to like ontologies, we tend to separate everything out. China and Russia have a different perspective. Russia is coming from more of a critical standpoint. They look at that and they realize how to pick it apart and how to subvert it and how to use it against us. And I think we're seeing that in Ukraine. I think we're seeing that in Estonia. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we've already seen it here. But I think when you think about this differently as an informatization of the space, that takes you down a path of thinking about each tool and how does it apply to information. So in other words, it's not just about the fake news. It's not just about cyber attacks. It's about the media. It's about the economy. It's about how do you pollute information about the economy. We see that in their discussions with Belarus. We see that in their discussions with former former CIS states. Talking about how, the economies here are better and the Western ones are much more volatile. So is that information warfare? Is that economic warfare? My point is that these things all overlap. Mm-hmm. Also in terms of how they delegitimize elections, when they send in their own version of election observers to go in and counter what the Western election observers say. Well, is that them going in and making a mockery of democracy? Yes, but that also undermines faith in democratic institutions. This is also apparent in their military doctrine. And just like China, Russia has developed and adapted the military doctrine based off of choices that the United States has made, but I don't think that the US has fully really understood the implications of some of those choices. Choices such as the output of the revolution of military affairs and the Powell Doctrine and shock and awe and things like this. Our enemies watch that, our adversaries watch that, and they've adapted in kind. And we kind of really haven't fully adapted to that mindset yet of using all of these different tools in a comprehensive way that's tied to a direct strategy.
Are we looking at, more of the same, or are we looking at things getting much worse looking forward as successful experiments, evolve, like Petya that evolve very quickly? Are we looking at more predatory malware, or are we looking at even more advanced tactics as well, Jan?
I just want to give an example which happened this summer. The experiment was in the Black Sea. Russia decided to influence the GPS signal. So the ships suddenly noticed that they are 30 miles from their original directions. What the implication that could be on the airplanes, what it could be into general safety, the control, the weather forecasts. Think about this. This is an experiment that happened this year, this summer, just a few months ago. So.
Yeah, I think we're seeing the tip of the iceberg here. It's going to get worse, and there are going to be more and more advanced techniques being used, which keeps those of us on the defensive side on our toes. There's a lot of hope being put into quantum computing. That'll be good for a little while, but then eventually the bad guys, if you will understand it as well or as better than we do and exploit it. So we constantly have to try to be one step forward. And I personally think that one of the ways to do that is to start with our education process. A lot of people can talk about, going into boards of directors and so on and having people in there who don't know how to spell security, much less cyber. That's changing somewhat, but I don't think that's where the emphasis should be. The emphasis should be on your kids and your grandkids and teaching them that this is really, really important stuff. We teach them a lot of other things that are important from the time they're really, really small. And by the time they get bigger, they realize, oh, now I understand why I was taught all that stuff. Well, today it's largely ignored, in the United States anyway. And so I think we have to start there, down in the elementary schools, and get them to understand what this cyber stuff is all about.
Yeah, and I think there are models that we can look at that demonstrate the success of that. So something I point to is Finland, and I've done a lot of work with the Finns on this topic. And of course, the Finns, as many of you know, have a very fantastic education system, one of the best in the world. It's different than the United States, right? It's much more homogenous. The population is much smaller. However, some of the lessons there in terms of education and also in terms of educating the populace, not just with telling them what cyber security is and things like that, but teaching them critical thinking skills, teaching them how they can actually identify between fake news and not fake news, or and also just what the implications of these different types of activities are. Just to take the Finland analogy one step further, or a comparison one step further, they have a very robust civil defense system, right? I mean, they still have the draft, but the connections between the industry and the government are very robust there. They're very codified. The government pulls in industry when you get up to, and it's considered a great honor. They pull in industrial leaders and tell them about the national security situation and keep them part of that conversation so that it can trickle down that way. But at a more systemic level, I don't think we're really going to be seeing much of a difference until we can get out of this reactive mindset that we're in. I mean, right now we're in the mindset of we identify a new threat and then we try to fix it, or we try to create patches to prevent that thing from happening again. Until we can build a better way of thinking about cybersecurity. And this, I always like to think back to the days of the Cold War when nuclear weapons were first developed and we didn't know how to think about them. I mean, it took years, it took decades really to come up with mutually assured destruction and all these theories of deterrence. China and Russia have both come up with ideas of how to use cyberspace, and they're really willing to kind of go to the nth degree. Whereas in the United States, we tend to think, oh, well, the law of armed conflict applies, and we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that. We worry about the escalation dynamics, which I think is appropriate. However, that precludes us from being able to be proactive in going after some of these things and showing our adversaries that we have the capability and the willingness to to shape the cyber environment in a way that's beneficial to us.
How would, and if you have any questions, are there people lining up? I have one more, and then I'll let Dmytro talk a little bit about Ukraine as well. But the traditional security stack, as it's being deployed across enterprises, organizations, how capable is that to withstand these pressures that are building from Ukraine to China and elsewhere?
Thank you. Not able.
That's right.
We've been testing different tools and contemporary technology. We work with different companies who give us testing. I must say there is products which well advertised but incapable. It's good to use the technologies. We've been able to model the behavior, so Sandbox has been proven some very strong, saved a lot of particular. But majority of the viruses that's been constructed is specifically, like yesterday we talked about the personalized medicine, now personalized viruses. That's possible to detect through the technology, but also the new approaches which are emerging with the cyber. It's not anymore firewalls or the classical defense infrastructure. It's more changing of these states. So this pattern recognition and fixing the pattern and detecting the changes that are taking place in the environment, that's probably the most advanced technology which enables us to see, not to stand and defend the castle, but actually seeing what's happened within the castle and where the anomalies takes place. And one thing that I want to just to support my colleagues, education, but also the global cooperation. If we say this is just US or it's just Ukraine or just Germany, this is not going to work. Right. The cyber world, Russia is deploying cyber activism across the globe. And important, as I've been in a discussion with US colleagues from the White House, is we also understand the problem of attribution. It's quite difficult in the cyber world to say, this is Russia. We are saying Russia, or this is China. This is attribution. And I have a personal comment to me from Speaker Peskov, who said, no, do you have a proof? Because they try to use human beings to engineer an attack. This is also an interesting form of attack. There is no virus, just organized attack, leveraging the human behavior of the click. So we face this as well. So the world will have to look how we address and cooperate and build a commonwealth in the same way that we built NATO or United Nations.
Are you guys ready for a few questions?
Sure.
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick targeted question. Why do you think that Facebook and Google and the FBI and the US security experts were so ill prepared to protect against Russian attacks? I understand the need for education, but why were they caught so unawares?
Well, I wouldn't say they were unaware. You might have been unaware, but they weren't unaware. Part of the issue we face here is that we are a free society, and nobody wants to impinge on that.
Right, so by protecting, then that would be impinging on our freedom?
Some people would say that.
Okay.
Sure. And Russia is extremely strong in actually looking at the weakness. They see the strengths of the freedom as a weakness of the Western society, and they use it against the society. That's the whole philosophy, to find and attack this way.
But that is exactly the same as during the Soviet era. We seemed to be weak because we were open, transparent, easily sabotaged. And by the way, I recommend Frederick Pohl's book, The Cool War, C-O-O-L, The Cool War from the 1960s. It's really being read all through Washington now, because this phase of Cold War is much more active than the Cold War was. It's much more vigorous, much more sabotage, which Frederick Pohl describes in that novel. But I have one very quick question, and then I'm going to follow that up. Is Estonia under the same level of attack, or is it more resilient than the Ukraine has been?
So I would say it's under the same level of attack. The answer is yes to both, essentially. However, I mean, they're also in NATO, and that is a really big, that makes a very big difference.
But that is a clue. The point is that Estonia has based its security not on the chimeric and absolutely insane notion that we are going to prevent viruses, that we are going to gain security by shutting doors. It has never worked. Of course, I'm the author of the Transparent Society. I predicted in '97 it would never work, and it will never work. Estonia bases its security on transparency and having less to defend. Now, my main point is simply this. All across the Cold War, the logic of the KGB was the same as the logic today. We are open in the West, we're defenseless. But we were able to staunch them with one basic thing, and that is every time they were better at tradecraft, spycraft, tradecraft than we were, we would simply win defectors. And we're not getting those defectors now because we don't have a clear moral high ground. If we were drawing in as many Chinese or Russians as we used to get during the Cold War, then all of this stuff would collapse the way it did back then.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's wrong, but I also think that things have changed in the United States since then. I think the enemy was much clearer at that time. There was more unity in our society. One of the things Russia's been very good at doing is using pressure points within society to create division, right? So there have been several reports that have come out recently talking about how they created these fake Facebook accounts under names like Secure Our Borders or Black Lives Matter or things like that, and they would post these very obnoxious and inflammatory things to try to get reactions from the other side. So we're in a position right now in our society where even if we did know that Russia was the enemy, is China the enemy? Is ISIS the enemy? I mean, this becomes a policy problem, right? But I think within our society, the divisions that are there, because are amplified by social media in a way that we haven't figured out how to deal with yet.
Any other questions? Any other closing comments? We have like 50 seconds.
I think that it's too simplistic view. We can't compare the ages of the Cold War, and I grew up during the Soviet time in the Soviet Ukraine. So I lived through the independence. And now I see how the things get transformed into, and I would never imagine that Ukrainian soldiers will be defending Ukrainian soil from a Russian enemy, Russian soldiers on Ukrainian soil. It's a kind of a nightmare story which nobody believed. But this is something that I'm living the last 3 years in the whole my nation. The cyberspace is interesting because you can masquerade yourself up to anything. And it's a question about social media companies. Would they try to get together and find out the policy? Will the journalistic policy emerge? Will the cyber companies, the cybersecurity companies, start working and collaborating together? And the more difficult question is, would the government collaborate on the cyber world or cyber defense, take into account that they are one of the major buyers on the zero-day vulnerability into the black market? So that's the reality we live in, and I think we will see a much more challenging environment.
If I can just add one thing really fast. The panel earlier.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Real quick.
Real quick. The panel earlier talking about Retina, right? And talking about different topologies. That's a good way of thinking about what Russia does. It's overlaid, and there's all these different things feeding into each other.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.